me just fire up my classrooms. So, there were many forms of racism during the 1900s through the 1950s. One of the most common examples were the Jim Crow laws. So the Jim Crow laws practiced complete segregation. So there were different waiting rooms for the African Americans. There were different buses, water fountains, schools, all of that. And that was just to maintain white superiority and make sure that they didn't interfere or interact or integrate into the society.
Surely there had to be effects of this racism. Would you be able to tell me about those?
Well, yes. There were immense amounts of racism, if you weren't able to tell. So African Americans began to stand up for themselves. So that led to the Civil Rights Movement, which started in the 1950s. I mean, honestly, the benefits were that whites maintained their superiority, and they still felt like African Americans weren't treated equally, which is what they wanted. So whites got what they wanted. African Americans, they didn't really get what they wanted. They were treated bad. But then they started standing up for themselves, which led to the Civil Rights Movement. What forms of racism existed from 1951 to 1979?
Well, in this time period, racism in politics really became kind of a power struggle, because it was starting to say where African Americans and minorities in general were having power, meaning if they were able to vote, that could sway the elections from ways that white people didn't want. And so you had a lot of these issues where civil rights at the time were to combat these forms of silencing and suppressing black people, where you had it in the forms of people being discriminated against on hiring, on working in the government, being hired, or even simple things like being allowed in places of business. And people used it kind of as a way to misinterpret the Constitution as saying, oh, well, it's a state's right to allow people to do this, when in reality they were violating others' rights.
What were the effects of racism?
Well, some of the positive effects that came out of the racism in this time were a lot of the passing of civil rights bills, which today are still considered quintessential bills to what's led to the advancements that black people have made in becoming equal. You had the Civil Rights Act, you had acts regarding property and discrimination.
Good morning, and pardon the interruption.
What were the justifications for racism?
Believe it or not, the Constitution was actually one of the biggest things that people used to justify racism, and people would argue that the 10th Amendment prohibited any federal civil rights laws passing, which, under their mind, that meant that, the government can legalize you doing the same thing that the government was doing. So people basically said, I'm allowed to hurt people, but the government can't tell me I can't hurt people.
Alright, and what euphemisms for racism were used?
Many people they claimed that integration would violate the natural kind of racial makeup of areas, because they argued that people would just kind of be with who they wanted in the natural way, and they argued that forcing integration would violate that natural makeup, which is basically that's just their way of sugarcoating that we don't want different people mixing together.
What benefits did racism offer for the dominant social group?
The racism in this time period allowed white people to keep control of many elections. They intimidated people into not wanting to come out and vote, into not wanting to spark social change, and it really was just used as an intimidation factor to kind of keep white people on the top.
Today, racism exists in the forms of police brutality and being treated as lesser in general. Many people make racist jokes, and they can be impolite towards other people. Many people also make assumptions about people based on their race, what they look like, their religion, and Many people have come together in result of brutality and inequality, and they've formed like riots and marches and organizations like Black Lives Matter. And they've also filed lots of lawsuits based on feelings of being treated unfair. Racism offers the dominant social group a sense of false security and feelings that they're superior to everybody else. It also makes them think that others cannot live up to them or take roles that they can just because of their race.